really talk about justice, you really first have to talk about morality, because justice is just one component of moral code. And then to talk about morality, you first have to talk about worldviews, because if you don't know where the person is coming from in terms of their worldview, your conversation about both justice and morality is going to become incredibly frustrating. So what I thought we would do is, on the first exhibit, talk about worldviews. So if we could take a look at that one. And what I would want to do is I want to go through these relatively quickly. And at the end of each of them, I want to just kind of open it up for comments and questions. And again, it's very difficult to have a conversation about justice without a context. And when I've looked at the various worldviews, you have your classical views of naturalism. You even have pantheistic views, and you have kind of a Judeo-Christian theistic view, and there's a variety of others. We don't really have time to cover everything, so I thought we would do is focus on three of the primary lanes, as I call them, in the interstate highway of naturalism first. And if you look at the definition of naturalism from a scientific view versus a philosophical view, there's just a myriad of different definitions. So what I've done is I've actually just simplified them into three, because there generally are three major strains with a variety of smaller divergencies, but there's three major strains that I've kind of gleaned over the years. The first one is what you would normally call scientific materialism. And that's really looking at the world through the eyes of matter. So if you look at the key components of a worldview generally includes things like, what is a person? What things do we value? Why do we value them? Purpose and meaning, morality, ethics, how you would apply morality. And then there's a variety of other things. We won't have time to cover them all, but various worldviews affect how you determine truth, your sources of knowledge, your view on consciousness, your view on free will, your view on a whole variety of other topics. So what I thought I would do is start off with this first category of scientific materialism and look at kind of a worldview through the eyes of matter. And I'm going to use as the example Professor Alex Rosenberg at Duke University. He is a philosophy professor. He was also the head or the chair of the philosophy department at Duke. And he has a fairly consistent view of the world and reality based upon scientific materialism. So I'm going to read a few of the things that he said in his book. It actually has a kind of a catchy little title, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And so these are all gleaned from this book. And I've gone back to check on his website to see if he's claimed any significant differences in his views over the years. And he still puts this book on his website. So I'm assuming these are still his views. So Professor Rosenberg says that people are just lumps of matter. There's no such thing as a soul. There is no such thing as a self. And there is no person. And by person, he means there's no first person point of view. And even though you think that you have a soul, a self, and a first person point of view, he says they're just an illusion. When you get to value, obviously, if personhood is essentially based upon your being a lump of matter, that's really going to affect his perception of value. So he says that people effectively have no intrinsic value. And in fact, his view is that nothing has intrinsic value. Now, you might place value to it, but it's not because it truly is of value. So when you get to then the category of purpose, his ideas become really quite interesting. And if you look through the eyes of matter, there really is no purpose. So he says in his book, whatever is in our brain driving our lives from cradle to grave, it is not purpose. But it does produce the powerful illusion of purpose, just like all of the other purposeless adaptations of the biological realm. So to him, there's no purpose to the universe. There's no purpose in the universe. There's no meaning to life. There's no reason to go on living. And any purpose you think you might have, or any plans that you thought you may have developed, again, are just illusions of consciousness. They're not real. So if you're really just a lump of matter and you have no intrinsic value, there's no real purpose or meaning in life, when you get to the category of morality, his views are fairly consistent. His view is that there really is no true right or wrong. And so he goes, basically, there are no natural, and this is a quote, there are no natural rights. Rights one has just by virtue of being human. To put it crudely, natural rights just by virtue of their composition. So his conclusion is that no one has natural rights, no one has moral rights. There is no difference between right and wrong, even though there is such a thing as an evolved core morality. And his statement is that our core morality, even though society has one, our core morality isn't true, right, or correct, and neither is any other. However, he does give a reason, which I think is very curious, to be moral, and that's because it makes you feel better. Then when you get to ethics, it's again pretty interesting because Professor Rosenberg is a tried and true adherent to scientism, strong adherent to hard determinism, and so his view is you have no free will. You do the things you do basically because physics and cause effects tells you to do so. Therefore, if you only do what physics and cause effect tells you to do, people don't deserve punishment or reward. So anyway, my point is pretty simple. It's really tough to have a conversation about justice with Professor Rosenberg, especially because he believes that people don't deserve punishment or reward. So let's shift to somebody that you know probably pretty well. And let's go to the category called, I call it biological naturalism. You could call it evolutionary naturalism, but this is, I simplistically call this the middle lane of the naturalism interstate highway. And Friedrich Nietzsche is an interesting example of this. This is viewing the world, viewing the universe, basically through the eyes of biology. So in this view, people are a type of animal. And interestingly, to some people who hold this view, not all humans are actually persons. Some people are more valuable than others. There's purpose in the universe, but not of it. And to some, their view is, well, the actual real purpose is advancing the human species. And I'll get into the other two in a moment, but let me go through some of the statements that Nietzsche made. And these are primarily from his books Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Beyond Good and Evil. They've been out obviously since 1900, 1920. So these are books that people are very familiar with. So I'll start off with his statement on personhood. And this is from, I believe it's Twilight of the Idols. He says, equality of souls before God. This falsehood, this pretext for the rancoon of all base-minded, this explosive concept, which finally became revolution, modern idea, and the principle of the decline of the entire social order, is Christian dynamite. So obviously, Nietzsche had an issue with the whole notion of equality of human beings. He didn't think that people were of equal value, had any kind of equality. Then when you got to the value side, this is another interesting quotation. He said, every elevation of the type man has hitherto been the work of an aristocratic society, and so it will be, always will be, a society believing in a long scale of gradations of rank and differences in worth among human beings, and requiring slavery in some form or another. So to Nietzsche, he basically believed that certain people like invalids had no right to live. He believed that Christians and Polish Jews were repugnant. He certainly believed that people did not have equal value whatsoever. I couldn't glean from these books a great deal in terms of his purpose, his view on purpose. So let's get to his ideas on morality. These are quotes from, I believe, Beyond Good and Evil. So he says, nothing is more unhealthy amid our unhealthy modernism than Christian pity. That's what he says first. Then he says, what is good? Whatever augments the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. So Nietzsche's view is kind of like the maximization of man as a species. He wanted, obviously, for the weak, the invalids, anything that contributed to weakness in mankind to perish. And he actually said not only should they perish, but you see in his view of ethics, he said, the weak and the botched shall perish, first principle of our charity, and one should help them to it. So he was all about kind of the Superman. He thought that, every, noble person should be a warrior. He believed that oppression and subjugation of people not only was part of the natural order, but it was actually good. So when you have a conversation with an extreme view like that, where in a way his view was, the improvement of the species, the improvement of man was a fundamental purpose, a core moral principle, and that your ethics should be applied accordingly. You look at people like his contemporaries, Ernst Haeckel. You look at people in that era, and it's very easy to see why Hitler, the Nazis, embraced this view of kind of the super person, and that people are not equal, and it's okay to actually eliminate people who are not carrying their weight, who are not contributing to society, who are not productive. And that kind of a moral framework and that kind of a perspective, a worldview, is actually one that's a little bit frightening. And a modern view, or a modern example, could include Peter Singer, though Peter Singer kind of, in a way, straddles the central lane and the lane I'm going to talk about in a minute. But Peter Singer has an issue with all human beings actually being persons. And so if you look at his book, Rethinking Life and Death, he says, human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. Hence, their lives would seem to be of no more worthy of protection than the life of a fetus. So this is in kind of an interesting worldview where, people are not viewed with the same value. And in some cases, not all human beings are even viewed as people. So how does that affect your perspective on justice? The challenge with his view, though, is whenever you have an issue of determining who a human being is, or rather who a person, which human beings are persons, and he is basically attributing or classifying personhood based upon capabilities. And his two key capabilities are, do you have effectively self-awareness, and do you have a sense of kind of your personhood, your being over time? And so based upon those two capabilities, he would say that, small infants, he basically says that parents should be able to kill children up to 28 days old. And I believe he may have extended that date. But the challenge then becomes, if Peter Singer can determine personhood based upon 2 criteria, why didn't he pick 3? Why those 2? Do we really have the right to define personhood? And my point is, it's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope when we're defining other human beings as not being humans, because this is exactly the type of thing that Ernst Haeckel did, who is a highly, highly respected zoologist in the early 1900s. He basically was saying that, you know, people with certain capabilities were not as fully human, and describing their worth based upon capabilities instead of based upon the fact that they're a human being. So the challenge with this perspective is, when you're having a conversation about justice with someone who has this as their school of thought, it's very, very difficult to have a conversation in terms of the equal application of justice, because they don't believe that morality should be equally applied. And in some cases, they may pick, you know, a narrow definition of not all people are human beings, or not all human beings are people. In other cases, their view is, you know, that naturalism is its own morality, but the 2 are highly related. You're basically ascribing worth and value to people based upon their capabilities, not really based upon the fact that they're a person. So let me give you an example. Stephen Hawking. If Stephen Hawking could not communicate via a computer, would he have had no worth? As a human being, would he have no worth? Brilliant, brilliant person, brilliant physicist. But according to this middle lane, it's indeed very, very dangerous, because you could very easily say that without the computer, 50 years ago, Stephen Hawking would have had no worth, and Ernst Haeckel and Nietzsche would have been saying, kill him. It creates all kinds of interesting conversations about morality, justice, and how justice should be applied, when you start saying that this human being is a person only if they can do certain things. This is how some European elites back in the late 1800s, early 1900s were justifying colonialism. You know, and they were saying that, you know, Native people in Australia, the Aboriginal peoples, you know, you don't have to treat them the same, because they're not of equal value, they're not of equal worth, because they don't have the same intellect and capabilities. Okay, now it's not because they couldn't attain that level of education and that level of sophistication, because they obviously have. It's just because someone was not educated at the moment. And so if you're saying that I'm not, you know, a certain IQ, or I haven't attained a certain educational level, or a certain set of competencies, that I'm of lesser value, you know, you just justified a whole lot of things. You justified, you know, European colonialism. You've justified a lot of different forms of slavery. And if you do that, you know, the kind of justice that results is a frightening form of justice. So let's shift to the last, you know, lane of the highway for a moment. And again, I know that I'm oversimplifying these, because if I don't, there's no way that you can get this conversation fit it within an hour time frame. It would just take forever. So the last category is what normally would be called atheistic humanism. Another way to call it would be basically humanistic naturalism. So this group of people, you know, does believe and share some of the beliefs of the materialists. They do believe and share some of the beliefs of the people who ascribe to, I'll call it, biological naturalism, but they differ in some key areas. One of the key areas that they differ in is the area of personhood. And so while they say that people, like the middle category, they say that people are a type of animal. They would claim that people are the most evolved animals, and therefore we kind of deserve a special, we're a special case, we're a special category. Now, Peter Singer wouldn't necessarily agree with that, obviously, but many others would. Then when you get to value, because science can't provide an authority for human value, materialism can't provide human beings with value, because the kind of value that biology provides is a scary kind of value. What they basically say is that people have value because we want them to have value. We say they have value. And then when you get to purpose, they basically say invent your own, because there isn't really one per se. And the morality tends to be utilitarian, kind of, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill's type of whatever benefits the most people kind of creates the greatest good is generally the type of moral code that they subscribe to, which is essentially group subjectivism. And then in terms of ethics, they say, there's basically a bias toward the greater good. And the person I use here is Paul Kurtz, and you may or may not be familiar with it, but he's written a number of books on the subject. One of them was the Humanist Manifesto 2000, which is the fourth of a series of documents like this. Another was his book, Affirmation, which basically is, he agree dramatically from kind of the middle category in terms of personhood. But in terms of value, his statement is that dignity and autonomy of the individual is the central value. He also says the need to respect the dignity and worth of all persons in the world community. He sees that human value and morality that's based on the equal value of each person is important to human survival. Okay, so what's really interesting with this group of people is they acknowledge basically that matter can't ascribe us value. Biology can't ascribe us value. Therefore, we're going to ascribe it to ourselves. And what they've observed is the type of value that biology provides is frightening, because that type of value could be used to justify World War II. It could be Hitler basically murdered 10 million people, 6 million were Jews, because he saw them of lesser value. So they say, okay, we can't deal with that type of morality. People have to have equal value in order for the type of morality to exist that we want to exist. But the challenge with this perspective is, and this is actually the case, the Humanist Manifesto was signed by 141 people. Richard Dawkins was one of them, which I find is interesting. But 141 people said, we have value, and all human beings have equal value because we say they do. But what happens if another 141 people disagree with them and they publish their own manifesto? So are they going to then revert to naturalism and fight it out to determine who's right? Who has the moral authority to ascribe value to people? If it's people that have the authority to ascribe value to us, then people have the authority to take it away from us. That's the frightening thing about this type of morality, this type of worldview. And it's good that they embrace human value. It's good that they embrace the idea of morality. It's good that they do want to apply ethics equally. It's good that they do want, to, magnify the greatest good for society. But the challenge is they have no moral authority to proclaim these things any more than another group of people would have the authority to proclaim the opposite. So while we might agree with some of the things that they say, the challenge is they really have no authority for saying them.
Maybe the authority could come from that we describe value as a consensus, as a race to each other. And since it's a consensus, in other words, we're the sprout of the sovereignty, that we agree that there's this baseline value of our humanity, that's the source and the legitimacy. If not as a single group or a small group, but as a majority whole.
Okay, so if it's a majority call, then you just justified slavery in the South.
I'm referring to a lot of humanity here. Well, I mean, and you can't, I don't know, sleeping in the South is tricky because.
But you see my point? In the South, there were roughly 12 million people. About 8 million roughly were white. About 3 plus or minus million were African Americans. And the majority made the decision that that group of people was not of equal value. So if you're looking to value based upon human authority, the best you can do is get a majority view. And what if the majority view decides you have no value?
That's also how the
right?
Holocaust happened, right?
I'm sorry?
The Holocaust?
Exactly. Well, and even in the, during World War II in Asia, the Japanese military felt like a lot of Chinese people did not have as much value, and there were literally the murders of hundreds of thousands of civilians because their perception was they didn't have the same value. So if we're waiting for the world to agree that we all have equal value, we're going to be waiting a very, very, very long time. Because up to this point, I can't see a point in history where they have agreed. And if we're going with a majority view, then how big of a majority do you need? How big a majority do you want? And is the majority always right? That's the interesting thing about a perspective of justice and morality based upon pure humanism. Now let's switch gears. Let's go to the next worldview. And this is one that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and that is theism. And I'm going to use, the worldview of theism as kind of a combination of Judeo-Christianity. And the interesting thing about this worldview is personhood in this worldview is not based upon what you're made of. It's not based upon your superiority over another species or your capabilities. And it's not dependent upon, someone else ascribing you personhood or any of these other things. The view of personhood is that God created you to be a volitional being made in his image. You are not a puppet, you are not an animal, and you're not merely a lump of matter. That you have value, that you are a person and have value because God gave it to you. Now, the interesting thing about this worldview is if God gave it to you, who can take it from you? If God gave it to you, you have it forever unless God wants to take it away. But again, the interesting thing about Christian theism especially is that your value to God is not dependent upon your goodness. It's not dependent upon your behavior. Your value is dependent upon God saying you are a value. So let me ask everybody a question really quickly, okay? Because there's a whole series of conversations about human value these days, and does one group of people have more value to another? And these are all incredibly valid conversations. So does any of you want to have low value, or would you like to be highly valued?
I would say the highest.
Okay. Do you want to be equally valued to other people, or do you want other people to be more highly valued than you?
Essentially equally valued.
Okay. Do you want to be valued highly and equally everywhere you go all the time?
Yes.
I think everyone does. I mean,
Okay. And then do you want that to change over time? Or do you want to always be valued?
I don't want it to change.
Okay. So this now is an interesting conversation because the only one who can give you value that is high, equal, universal, and unchanging in truth, and not just be an opinion, is God. Because God is the only objective, independent valuer who never changes, who is universal, who is eternal. And the interesting thing about Christian morality is, according to Christian morality, how highly did God value you? God
He
so
said
loved
it
the world
too.
that he gave his only son,
Yeah.
that whoever believes in him shouldn't perish. And then you see Peter saying, God is not willing that any should perish. Then you see Paul saying, pray because God wants everyone to be saved. So the notion of your value, God values human beings according to a Christian perspective as much as he valued his own human life. You can't get any higher value than that on this planet. That's the unique thing about Christianity, is that not only are you a person created in God's image, but your value was demonstrated by God himself by coming into this world, dying for us. He demonstrated our worth, and it's unchanging, and it's eternal, and it's forever. Okay. Now, we obviously need to accept and receive what he did for us. But then the other thing about Christian theism, as well as Judeo-Christian or the Jewish tradition, is there actually is ultimate purpose in the universe and purpose within the universe. And the thing I find interesting about kind of the biological naturalism view, and you see this in I believe it was Stephen Weinberg, no, Jacques Monod. Jacques Monod said basically that we see purpose in the universe, but we don't know why. We see a variety of other scientists that are saying, wow, man, there's purpose in the universe, but there's not purpose of the universe. And that's sort of like saying, there's purpose for carburetor, but there's not purpose for the car. But the Christian view is there is purpose for the carburetor, there's purpose for the car, there's purpose for everything. There is ultimate purpose for the universe and for people. And because God values us so highly, he basically has demonstrated, a moral code for us. And that's what we're going to get into next. And that moral code is supposed to be applied equally to everyone all the time. And so if I ascribe to a Judeo-Christian worldview, which most of Western culture has for the last hundreds and hundreds of years, it's a relatively recent phenomenon to say that, my worth, my value, and justice is based upon what I'm made out of or what I can do. So a conversation about justice based upon these different worldviews creates a lot of interesting perspectives. So let me ask a couple of real quick questions before we dig into the morality topic. And that is basically, what's your personal worldview? What do you believe a person is? What kind of value do you believe that we possess? And do we truly, have purpose? Do we truly, are we truly capable of making our own decisions? Are we truly morally culpable? Because that's going to affect everything that you say about morality. And in reality, when you look at it from a purely biological standpoint or purely matter kind of standpoint, there is no purpose and there is no meaning per se, according to basically anybody who holds those views. And when you get to the humanist view, they also acknowledge that according to a naturalistic view, there is no meaning, there is no purpose. But you know what? We're here, we might as well invent one for ourselves. It seems to be not a particularly satisfying perspective of reality, but that's one they subscribe to. So let's go to the conversation about morality now. Okay, and again, when you have a conversation about justice, and this is what always interests me, and I'll give you an example. When I was a little kid, my parents would take me to church, and the church that I attended, I would always hear about one moral attribute all the time. I heard about love. I heard about love. God is love. God is love. And that's great. It was a wonderful message. But I tended to not hear about the other moral attributes that the Judeo-Christian moral tradition conveys that God possesses. And when you look at the Old Testament, when you look at the New Testament, you generally see 6 key principles. And these 6 key principles are seen in the 613 mitzvahs, commands in the Tanakh. These principles are also seen in the New Testament. The other thing in the New Testament is Jesus then lives out these principles and demonstrates not only that it can be done, but shows you how you're supposed to live these 613 mitzvahs. And the interesting thing I try to convey to my Jewish buddies is that just because there's 613 mitzvahs doesn't mean there's 613 ways to be moral. They didn't have the internet back then. They didn't have a lot of things back then. There were issues that they hadn't encountered. Those are 613 ways of being moral. But when you simplify it, there's really 6 key moral principles. Be truthful, be faithful, be good, be pure. The Bible also calls that holy. Be just and be loving. So notice that justice, being just, is just one of the 6. And the thing that you find in the scriptures, okay, here you had Jesus who, the Bible says never sinned. Okay, so he was able to be truthful, faithful, good, pure, just, and loving without, I guess another way of saying it is, he was able to be good without lying. He was able to be good without being unfaithful. He was able to be loving without being unjust. So the biblical perspective, the Judeo-Christian perspective on morality is, these are 6 key moral attributes that God possesses that we're supposed to imitate that are non-conflicting. That we can theoretically do all of these things. And for something to be moral, it really has to be all 6. So if I claim that I'm being loving, but I'm stealing from you, am I being loving? No, because I'm violating the principle of goodness. If I say that I'm being faithful to my wife, but meanwhile I'm, sleeping around, I'm really not being faithful. So to give you a few examples and just of what these things really are, to be truthful is obviously to speak the truth. So in the Bible, you would see specific examples. It says, don't commit perjury, don't libel or slander other people. And, our whole entire judicial system is based upon the premise that people should tell the truth. You can't have justice without truth. Then you have the issue of faithfulness. And that's where you're supposed to keep your commitments and promises, honor your relationships. So this is where in business would say, hey, you got to keep your contracts. You sign the contract, you need to abide by it, because people are relying upon you doing what you claimed you're going to do. And then you get to, the other examples of, don't cheat on your spouse, don't abandon your children. When you get to the topic of goodness, it includes things like, do things that help people. Don't intentionally do harm. Don't steal. So in a business context, my products need to be beneficial to people. My sales practices need to be beneficial, faithful, and truthful. My production processes need to also not violate the next one, purity. So if I'm developing a product and I'm truthful to my clients, I'm faithful to my clients, and my product is really great, but I'm dumping PCBs in the Passaic River, I'm not being moral. And in fact, that's what several large companies were doing. A friend of mine is still cleaning up the Passaic River after decades. But purity includes things like, don't sexually abuse others, don't pollute the planet, don't commit impure sexual acts. Simple things like don't eat roadkill. Well, what does that have to do with anything? That means basically don't pollute yourself. Botulism and all this other stuff that basically you're supposed to care about your own health and your own purity. And don't expose others to infectious diseases. This was the whole thing, about, you would quarantine people in the Old Testament, because you're supposed to love each other enough to not, knowingly, willingly expose them to something that that they could get to harm them. I'm going to skip over the category of justice for a moment and jump down to the category called being loving. And these most people would tune into pretty easily. And those of you who are familiar with scripture, when you think of 1 Corinthians 13, you think of things like love is showing compassion, it's kindness, it's patience, it's giving to people, it's mercy, it's grace. Grace is giving people good things that they don't actually deserve. It's forgiveness. It's even simple things like friendliness. So the category of love in the Bible is just the number of, examples of that are just innumerable. Again, being in business for years, one is you don't charge people interest. And I think that a lot of banks could probably, tune into this one. The idea was, there's no problem with charging interest, but you don't charge the impoverished. You help others in need. You're kind to immigrants. You show people basic kindness and dignity. So this is the moral code that most of us would subscribe to based upon a Judeo-Christian perspective. And the thing that I find very interesting is that group of people that are called atheistic humanists. This is where they get most of their moral principles. They certainly don't get it from materialism, and they certainly don't get them from biology. And Michael Onfray, who is a French atheist and social commentator, actually really laments that humanism has embraced Christian moral principles. And he's advocating that humanists should ditch, the Judeo-Christian perspective of morality and come up with their own new moral code based primarily upon utilitarianism. And I'm going, okay, but how would you really divorce yourself from these moral principles? These moral principles seem to be pretty universal. They're certainly non-conflicting. And this is the set of moral principles that has elevated Western civilization for hundreds of years. And it's certainly, again, coming from the business world, This is what's made economic progress and prosperity possible. Without these set of principles, we'd all be living in poverty. It's an interesting, I guess, perspective of what would our society actually be like without these principles. Now let's talk about justice. Okay. And we'll spend a lot of time discussing these, but when you look at the Judeo-Christian perspective, Judeo-Christian worldview, and again, I know I'm oversimplifying, but a lot of times you have to do that for brevity. But I view that there's really 5 major themes or threads through the Judeo-Christian view of justice. And I went back and checked on myself a variety of Jewish scholars, and I've looked at a variety of philosophy websites. And the philosophers would categorize these things and slice them and dice them into so many different categories that it sort of makes your head spin. So I'm simplifying what you actually see in the Judeo-Christian perspective. And the first principle that you really start with is the notion of equity. And that basically means that you treat others like yourself. You treat other people as though they have equal value. You treat them fairly. When we think of justice, we normally think of how do we address our grievances or how do we restore justice? But equity, the perspective of equity, is the proactive way that we achieve justice in all of our simple acts every single day. The simple things of opening a door for someone, the simple things from, gee, someone bought something from me and I'm not going to shortchange them. The simple treating people fairly, treating people as though they have equal value. So I find this is interesting because when you look then at justice, what's the core foundation of it? The whole assumption of justice in a Judeo-Christian perspective is what?
That God's, not just God's will is expressed.
Well,
but
it's even more basic than that. It's that all people have value, that all people have equal value in the eyes of God and should be treated that way. And from a Jewish perspective, the general, and this is Rabbi Teluskin, I can't recall the correct pronunciation of his last name, but his perspective is, historically the Jewish community has believed that if you do not provide, criminals with punishment, you are denying those people who are harmed justice. You are not treating them with the value that they truly possess. And he makes a good point. He makes a very good point. But I find that the fundamental bedrock for the Christian and the Jewish perspective on value is the equal value of every human being. And then, if we accidentally do harm to people or we intentionally do harm to others, the second component comes in, and that's stop. So if there's a law, for example, that harms people unjustly, undeservedly, it needs to be changed. If we're doing things, that possibly even without intent are harming other people, we need to stop. So the second component of justice is, if you're doing harm, stop doing harm. So, this is where legislation is important, because not all legislation is just. At times, injustice is actually codified into our legal system, into our laws. And where we have laws that are unjust, that don't truly treat people with equity. And there's a difference between equity and I'll use the example of, economic equality. Equity does not mean economic equality. Equity means the same opportunity. Equity means the same treatment. Equity means the same perspective of human value. But there's a component of freedom that God has obviously given us and that we as human beings possess. And that freedom includes consequences for our actions. So if I choose to study hard, I might get an A. If I choose to not go to class, probably not going to happen. So I can treat people equitably, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give them all an A. I'm treating them the same in terms of they all have the same opportunity to make an A, but it's really up to them. Then you get to the idea of restoration. And a lot of times, and you'll see this in the Old Testament a lot, someone's freedom will have been taken. Well, it should be restored if it's taken unjustly. Property was taken. And in the Old Testament, the property had to be returned, and it actually had to be returned twofold, and I'll tell you why. And in some cases, it had to be returned fourfold. Reputations need to be restored. If you're fired unjustly, your position should be restored, or you should be made whole in some way. If your health was harmed, because of product, inadvertently had side effects, whoever was responsible for that needs to try to restore your health to the degree it's possible. Public safety, etc. So the whole idea of restoration is undoing the damage that was done, restoring what was taken or damaged, and making people whole, returning what was lost. So actually, if you found somebody's wallet on the sidewalk, the principle of restoration, even though you haven't done anything wrong, is it finders keepers, or should you try to give it to them? You return it. You try to restore it. You try to return things to the previous condition. Now the two points of justice that people probably tune into more than others is the ones that we really see in the court system. That's punishment and reward. And within the Judeo-Christian perspective, there was punishment.
Yeah, I got a question for you, brother.
Sure.
So when it comes to it, does the Christian view of morality when it comes to justice promotes a retributionist mindset, so there can be a metaphysical rebalance of justice or rehabilitation? Or do you want to confidently you say both? And if you say both, I really want to hear your answer.
Well, it definitely, the correction aspect is very, very clear, because what you're trying to do is cause people to see, I guess a biblical perspective is that there's a proportionality. So like, for example, I think it was the Babylonians who, if you stole something, the penalty was either death or some sort of incredible, maiming kind of thing. So we would say that probably isn't particularly just, because it sure doesn't line up with what was actually done. So there's punishment as correction implies an equivalence to the harm done. And so when you see in the Old Testament, the eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth, I believe it was far less about retribution than it was about commensurate punishment, because it's impossible for us to truly achieve justice for everything. And I'll get into this more in a minute, but like if someone harms me and they're dead, I can't punish them. It's like I will not receive justice. Some justice is impossible. And so when you get the idea of like this cosmic rebalancing, our punishment of an individual does not atone for what they did. Okay? It doesn't take away the wrong, what it does is it tries to recompense the person wronged.
So I think let me shoot two classical biblical examples at you here.
Sure. Because
So
I
let's
may
say-
have misunderstood your question.
so what is like, so one is like, okay, so I steal, or let's say I do something, I rob a bank, right? And I have to go and spend. So in other words, instead of losing money, I lose time of my life being incarcerated. That's like the price to kind of equal restore justice. Or is it like so? Or is it rehabilitation to teach me skills so I can get out of this criminal atmosphere? Now, I'm thinking of a biblical example here. I'm going to give you two. I think of David. There's countless examples of David messing up before God. He always he does severe sins, but he always repents with sincerity. He always goes and he wants to correct. He wants to be better. He wants to make amends for this. Then from there, we look at someone like the classic example, even though biblical scholars sometimes actual story, the adulterous woman, where Christ kind of goes in the action of cleansing her, saying okay, you're not worthy to judge her. In other words, not doing this communal sense of appropriate retribution, justice for actions. But instead, he says, okay, here is his action of atonement through your love of me, through one and emulate that love of me. Because he forgives her, he gives her absolution. But then, and the absolution is a means that she's going to strive to change.
Well, wait, he didn't actually in that story give her absolution. What he said basically is go and sin no more. And if other people are not accusing you, then I'm not going to do it. Because when you looked at the law, they were supposed to bring both parties. Okay, and so their accusers were actually unjustly accusing her. So if she committed adultery, they were supposed to bring the person who she committed adultery with, according to the legal code. They didn't do that. So because there was an unjust accusation, okay, they were only accusing one of the supposed parties and not both. It wasn't truly justice done justly. So Jesus says, I'm not going to accuse you, but he doesn't give her, he doesn't say, oh, well, everything's okay. What he says is go and sin no more. And from a Judeo-Christian perspective, from a Christian perspective, and even from a Jewish perspective, ultimately the ultimate forgiver is God. Because ultimately he is the one who we are sinning against. We're violating his moral code. And it's interesting because, we die, we've never satisfied justice, okay? Because we can't truly atone for our own sins. We can't truly do that. And even in the Jewish system, it was, you weren't truly atoning for your sin. All you were doing is covering them because God was going to be the ultimate forgiver. And that's one of the subjects we're actually going to cover next is, everybody tends to want justice, right? If they're the one harmed. But what do you want if you're the one who did the harm?
You want forgiveness.
You tend to not want justice.
That's what. So maybe we're going to get on this later, but there's a thing I know among a lot of leftist circles to deal with the intercommunity violence is it's called this restorative justice. Everyone gets together, they get the wrong, they get the guy that did it, and they talk about, okay, how do we make amends to the community? It's a weird thing because it almost builds up saying all you got to do is say you're sorry. But
yeah, but in effect, that does not secure justice. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes, but let me ask you a couple of real quick questions since we're on this list. Okay. So number one, we already talked about that the foundation of Judeo-Christian justice is equality. And that idea has basically been borrowed by humanism. now let me ask you this. If you were wronged, who should be punished?
The person that did the wrong,
Why? Why shouldn't somebody else be punished?
because it's not just.
Because he did nothing wrong. So, and then how should they be punished? So if they took $100 from you, what should the punishment be?
They should pay back the 100.
Okay, and so the Old Testament, what they would say is you pay back the 100 to restore it, but then you pay back 100 more. Why? So that you feel the harm that you did to the other person. And in the case of an earning asset, you actually had to pay back 4 times. And that's because when you stole an earning asset, you weren't just stealing, you know, the cow or the ox or whatever it was. You had stolen the future calves, the future income, the future milk, all of the, and so you actually had to return what it was that was stolen and your future income stream. Now, one of the things I find interesting that's happened in American justice, which my neighbor was an attorney for one of the large New York firms. Here, I think it was Roundup had this big case, you know, over, or Monsanto rather, over Roundup herbicide. An individual was harmed, and the individual was awarded a roughly, I can't remember, is $1 billion plus settlement. And the interesting thing about, you know, the difference between torts and criminal cases in the United States, a criminal case, you have to prove guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. And in a civil case, you have to prove more likely than not that they were guilty. So it's 51% chance that they're guilty. Okay, so this one person was awarded billions of dollars, even though they didn't actually experience billions of dollars in harm, because the jury made the decision that they were going to award that one person as though they were all of the people that had ever been harmed by Roundup. Is that just?
Wait, what was that? $1 billion? That's crazy.
It was multiple billion. I think it was $1.6 billion or a couple $billion for one person.
What happened in that case?
Well, the person developed cancer, but they couldn't conclusively prove it was from Roundup. You know, and it could have been a variety of different causes, but the attorneys were able to convince the jury that it was at least a 51% probability that it was Roundup. Therefore, the person was awarded billions of dollars, not because of the actual harm that they had experienced, but they were awarded the billions of dollars, you know, as though they were all of the people who had ever been harmed by Roundup in the history of time.
I mean, like, I guess a great example, maybe more recently, right? Like, let's look at, I mean, one is like the chemical countries, the oil spill, but look at Agent Orange, all the soldiers, all the Vietnamese that were affected by it just for being its proximity. That has deep causal generational effects.
So this is what, I'm sorry, were you talking about Agent Orange?
Yeah.
Okay.
That doesn't just affect you, it
Right.
affects your children, that affects your grandchildren.
Right.
Because of the permanent mutation. So it's like,
right.
And I mean, it's like, and then we want to go to look at that, and there should be some type of distribution. But then we look at, like, I guess a great example, maybe BLM right now with police. Is it the police officers, the institution themselves? Because let's say you're a good cop, your sovereignty, but because you're attached to this institution that is at best, or that has a complicated relationships in society, because one end you preserve justice, but it can be abused. Do they deserve harm for being part of that organization because they are treated as if they are the ones that, since the day of its inception in America, been perpetuating racial injustice? Or
Bess and I talked about this before the meeting, and this is a topic that, is literally a 2+ hour conversation.
sorry.
And it is, no, it's a great conversation. I was actually thinking about covering it at the end of this, but we both kind of concluded that it would make the presentation 3 hours, and then you guys would be up to about 2 in the morning. So it would probably be better to cover as a separate talk. But your point is exactly, the issue is in a traditional Judeo-Christian perspective, the person who did the harm is the one to be punished. And they were generally punished proportionately. And it's interesting, when people stole things, they weren't thrown in jail. They had to return the money. And you think of how many people are in jail because they stole something, when the real punishment, the real justice, would not be for them to be sitting there doing nothing, having taxpayers spending $35,000 to $50,000 a year to support the cost of them being in prison. Okay, the real benefit would be getting the person to pay back the money. Let him get a job and work it off. That would be more in keeping with justice. And then you get into the issue that you're talking about: who should be rewarded if there was a harm, and how do you determine that? And how many generations ago? And how do you really determine? And so here's a quandary that I'll throw out for you to ponder. Okay, do you want to be, if your great-grandfather committed murder and it was unpunished because they didn't find out about it, and then it was uncovered, but he's dead and your father's dead, is it just for them to now come to you and hang you for that murder? When you didn't.
That's like a wild thing in America, because it's like okay, let's it kind of is wrapped up in this idea of how people view white privilege, right? My ancestors don't go far enough back on either side of the country to bear that guilt, but there's certain subsects definitely to see like that they have to carry like this almost original sin in this social contract.
Yeah.
Where you're not the one that perpetrated, you're not the one that did it. This is not your burden. This is not your job to reconcile or reconstruct. That's not on you.
Well, the interesting thing is, in actuality, the majority of people who live in America today are the descendants of people who didn't even live in America in the 1800s. So you're talking about, a lot of issues, and, like reparations for slavery, which is a topic that I do actually suggest that you guys talk about, because it is a worthy topic of discussion. And I think it's really spoken about more emotionally than in terms of just really what is justice. But when you look at that kind of perspective, you go, is our entire society responsible for this? And if we're responsible for, the harm that was done generations and generations ago, but what if their descendants never actually experienced that harm? And then you have the perspective of, well, excuse me, well, if I'm the descendant of a person, and I'll use a crazy case, but it's actually very common. If I'm the descendant of someone who was a slave, am I worthy of restitution for that somehow? But what if my other side of the family, what if I'm mixed race, and the other side of the family was a slave owner? So do I owe myself restitution? You see, I mean, it just, the questions become just almost mind spinning. And that's why it's such a difficult issue. It's not as cookie cutter as people would believe it to be. And this goes into the whole issue of who should receive restoration, from who should they receive it? And what if something can't be restored? And I'll give you an example. Years ago, my grandmother's sister was a missionary, Christian missionary nurse in the Philippines from 1923 to 1943. And we obviously were at war with Japan at the time, Imperial Japan. The Philippines fell in 1941. So this group of civilian Christian doctors and nurses hid in the jungle for 2 years. Basically hiding from Japanese soldiers for 2 years, living off of, the kindness of the people that they could, run across. They were then discovered. They were discovered on a Sunday morning. They were worshiping in a clearing, and the Japanese soldiers found them, arrested them, brought them in. There's a deliberation about what to do. They knew who they were. They knew they were not soldiers. They knew they were civilians. They gave them 1 hour to pray, and then they summarily, systematically beheaded each one of them. And their bodies were thrown into a mass grave, and my grandmother's sister lies in the Philippines today. No one who was responsible was ever brought to justice, to my knowledge. It was sort of swept under the rug because, MacArthur wanted to, get all of this stuff behind him so that he could more peacefully, govern Japan. And so I look at that and I go, my family was never given justice. My grandmother was never given justice. And we can't. The people who did it are dead. Do I look to their descendants who are innocent for justice? Do I look to people who had nothing to do with it for justice? And so these are the real life cases. And so our family has basically chosen another approach. And you can kind of see it on the next and final slide. If you could go to that, please. We tend to love the idea of justice when we're the one harmed. And, our perspective on justice is that people deserve justice because people have value. And so we really want justice when our sense of self has been violated, when we've been treated as though we don't matter, when we've been harmed, when we've been hurt, when we've been degraded. We want justice. And the reason we want it, I believe, is because we do have value. And the reason other people want justice is they have value too. And so from a perspective, not just of a Judeo-Christian perspective, but a perspective of humanity, we want justice because we intuitively know that people do have value. But there's another moral principle in addition to justice, and that's love. So we show people love because they have value. We give people presents. We do kind things for people, not out of a sense of obligation, but because they have value. So justice and love are both dependent upon human value. And when you looked at the number of things that I kind of described love as encompassing, 3 of them were this idea of grace. The idea of grace is where we give people things that are unearned. And that could be a gift, it could be favor, it could be all these things. And so why do we give people unearned gifts? Because we value them and we love them. We look at the idea of mercy, okay? People, we all want mercy. Why? Because we don't want justice when we've done wrong. We want an escape from justice when we've done wrong. We tend to want justice when someone else did wrong. But if we're loving, we actually do show mercy. We don't give people the recompense that they actually deserve because we value them. And then we also get to this notion of forgiveness, is people want forgiveness and people give forgiveness because we value people and we love them. And the definition I like of forgiveness is when people choose to deny themselves justice to show love and restore relationships. And love is freely given, but it actually costs the giver. Love isn't free to the giver. It's free to the receiver. So when we talk about justice, and especially, I'll use the example of my grandmother's sister, we've kind of chosen and embraced the idea that, we're going to forgive. And we choose to deny ourselves justice to show love and to restore relationships. Because the key thing about Judaism and Christianity is relationships. First, for the relationship with God. According to the Old Testament and the New Testament, God created us, and I'm oversimplifying, but God created us because he wanted children to love. And he invites us to love him back. It's about a relationship. And then in the Old Testament, what's the second greatest command? First is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is your neighbor as yourself. It's about relationships. Now, we can choose to hold a grudge. We can choose to embrace offense. We can choose, to demand justice forever. Or we can choose to forgive. Forgiveness restores relationships in a way that justice can't. And the question that we have to ask ourselves at some point is, we will likely never truly receive justice in this world, apart from the return of Christ. And when Jesus comes, we're not asking for justice. What are we asking for?
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness, grace, and mercy. That's what we're asking for. And according to Christianity, that's what God gives us. He gives us the good that we don't deserve. He extends us mercy, and he gives us forgiveness. So as Christians, our challenge is to embrace the notion of justice, but to do it in a way that the ultimate objective of justice doesn't contradict love. We're trying to pursue justice that ultimately restores relationships. That's the real objective. It's easy to kill your neighbor, but the best way, or kill your enemy, but the best way to defeat your enemy is not by killing him. The best way to defeat your enemy is make him your friend. Is you love on your enemies. And it's up to them to choose to love you back. And that doesn't mean you don't defend your family and things like that, because you got to love your family too. But you see the point? And we do want to pursue justice for people. But the ultimate objective of justice is not retribution. The ultimate objective of justice is restoration of relationships. Restoring people to wholeness. It's the Jewish concept was this idea of shalom, which basically meant well-being. Okay, so it was in all areas. It was peace. It was prosperity. It was just living at peace and happily, kind of cohabitating with your neighbors. That's ultimately the objective of justice. But to do it, you can't divorce justice from love. And what grieves me about what I see in the media and with a lot of the riots that have happened in the name of justice, I saw no love. I saw no grace. I saw no mercy. I saw no forgiveness. I saw nothing that was about restoring relationships. I saw nothing that treated everyone of value. I saw people who were innocent having their stores burned down. I saw people's livelihoods that they spent 30 years building destroyed in a night. That's not about justice. That's about rage. That's about retribution. That has nothing to do with justice. And the reason why, we in America celebrate MLK Day, okay, instead of Malcolm X Day. Malcolm X was full of anger and rage, and he called white people the devil and the enemy. MLK basically said, wait a minute, we're all children of God. We're supposed to seek justice lovingly. How do we do that? Well, we need to do it in a way that we're actually exposing ourselves to the wrath and rage of others, not pouring our wrath and rage on them. That's why we celebrate MLK Day, because he pursued justice without sacrificing love. And that's why Malcolm X and MLK, though they lived in the same era, were certainly not cut out of the same cloth. And that's why we hold up MLK's example for our kids, because that's the way to pursue justice. And he didn't sacrifice justice. He didn't say, oh, racism is okay. And he didn't say, oh, well, you can go ahead and beat us and do whatever you want. No, they were strong. They were strong. And they spoke truth. And they stood their ground. But they did it in love. And what I see today going on doesn't look like anything that MLK would have done. And it certainly doesn't look like anything Jesus would have done. Because they're pursuing justice unjustly. That's not justice.